Clark, this is Lauren, my co-host and my wife.
Hey,
Lauren,
Lauren.
this is Clark.
Hi.
Which is more painful, being his co-host or his wife?
We almost had a spit take over here.
I'm joking. He's a delightful gentleman. I'm 100%.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm sure. Honestly, the co-host is worse. Hey there, Film Buds. Welcome back to the Film Buds podcast. I'm your host, Paul.
And I'm Lauren.
And we're joined today by our friend and returning guest, Clark Collis, who was back on in September for Shaun of the Dead. Clark, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we were glad to have you on. I had a great time last time, and just doing one of the three films of the Cornetto trilogy seemed like a poor way to do things. So I decided that we should, work our way through them. And yeah, this is actually perfect because I needed a UK film as well, because the UK is one of our top 5 downloaded countries. And so this month, all of our episodes are for countries that we have listeners in, and the UK is one of them.
No, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, so today we're going to be doing, as I mentioned, Hot Fuzz. It's the second film in the Cornetto trilogy, Edgar Wright's film. And if you didn't listen to the last episode, Clark wrote a book on Shaun of the Dead called You've Got Red on You, which is out now in the UK, and I think it's about to come out in the US.
Yeah, it was published November 18th in the UK, and it's coming out November 23rd in the US. So,
okay, perfect.
But wherever you are in the time continuum, you can either pre-order it or buy it. So that's either of those things. It is the perfect Christmas gift, I think. Or if you're listening to this in 6 months' time, the perfect beach read. Or in 9 months' time, the perfect Halloween gift. It really,
there you go.
whenever you're listening to this, if it's 20 years' time and the zombie apocalypse has happened and you're sitting in a ruined pub, then you can get out your copy and read it there.
And reminisce when zombies were just a what if. Yeah. But yeah, so we'll just sort of jump on into it. As always, we have a clip, so take a listen.
Sergeant Nicholas Angel, expert in hand-to-hand combat, armed response, and high-speed pursuit. He was so good, they reassigned him.
So that was Hot Fuzz, which came out in 2007. It's directed by Edgar Wright, and it stars Simon Pegg, Nick Frost. Let's see, where's the main cast? It's got Timothy Dalton. It's got Jim Broadbent, Paddy Considine, Rafe Spall. It's a real who's who of a lot of British character actors, honestly.
It really does have. I was rewatching it yesterday, and yeah, it's got this amazing cast. Obviously, it's Nick Frost and Simon Pegg again together after Shaun of the Dead and the sitcom Space that they made with Edgar Wright. And then it's got this great immediate supporting cast that we should talk about at some point. As you say, Timothy Dalton, Edward Woodward's in it, Jim Broadbent. And then it's just got, and then the rest of the people are either people that I, as a Brit, am very familiar with from films and TV, like Billy Whitelaw plays, who is just this legendary actress in the UK, plays the manager or the owner of the hotel where Simon Pegg stays at. And then it's just got cameos galore. Some of them actually, I didn't even realize that certain people were in it until I was watching this on Amazon, and they've got that sort of little trivia thing. And in the opening sequence alone, you've got which is fantastic. You've got cameos from Bill Nighy, Steve Coogan, Martin Freeman, But then you've also got this one scene where Simon Pegg goes to talk to his ex-girlfriend at a crime scene, and everybody's wearing masks. And it was weird watching that scene a little bit now when you go to a shop and everybody's wearing masks. But everybody's wearing masks in this scene, and I knew that one of his ex-girlfriend is played by Cate Blanchett. Completely unrecognizable because she's wearing a huge mask on her face. But one of the other sort of crime scene technicians who's wearing a mask is Joe Cornish, who would go on to direct Attack the Block and The Kid Who Would Be King. And I knew, and I'd interviewed Joe for my book about Shaun of the Dead because I knew that he played one of the zombies. But I had no idea that he also played one of the crime scene guys with the mask on his face. To be fair, no slam on Joe. It's not a particularly notable performance. I think he may only say one word or just a couple of words, but I had no idea that was him in the movie. Yeah, it's got both a deep bench cast in the sense that everybody's amazing and well known, certainly in Britain, but also, yeah, again and again, just these cats sort of popping up left, right, and center, which is really amazing.
No, absolutely. I saw this movie in theaters. I saw this actually before I saw Shaun of the Dead. And this movie is just, in so many ways, I think, going from Shaun of the Dead to Hot Fuzz, you see how much more sort of access that they have, how much sort of meaner, cleaner, better funded this thing is. And it's evident also in the cameos, because like, as you mentioned in that first scene, you have 3 right off the bat with Freeman, Coogan, and Nye. And then in that opening montage, the man dressed as Father Christmas that stabs him through the hand is Peter Jackson.
That's right.
And so you can already see how, like, from Shaun of the Dead to Hot Fuzz, like, everything has blown up. This movie, I really enjoy this one more so than Shaun of the Dead. I actually think it lives in kind of this weird otherworldly reality, kind of this strange Stepford Wives fish out of water narrative where everyone is in on this sort of joke and our main character isn't. And I think that it's really brilliantly funny. And all of these movies really, really hold up. All the way through. You, I guess, have probably seen Hot Fuzz the least out of us. Yeah.
This was my second watch through. I started with Shaun of the Dead years ago and didn't realize that there were more to the trilogy. But honestly, I really enjoy this one a lot. I think the humor is really spot on. I think that everyone is aware of the joke, but isn't like, winking at the audience so much that you can't also laugh with them. No, I think that this movie is so much fun and such a different tone as well from Shaun of the Dead, where even though the characters, I guess, especially for Nick Frost, are very similar, but they have their different ways of being iconic.
No, absolutely. This one is filmed in Wells, correct?
Well, yeah. For people who haven't heard the previous podcast, I should probably give a little bit of my relationship to the film. It is filmed in Wells, which is a rural. I think it's technically a city because Wells has a cathedral. So it's one of the, which is sort of how you define what a city is in the UK. If you've got a cathedral, no matter how small the town is, you get to call yourself a city. But it's in a rural area. It is about 3/4 of an hour's drive away from Bristol, which is a pretty big city, but it's not a big city. People may know Bristol because that's where Massive Attack come from. Cary Grant was born there. He was born Archie Leach in Bristol. It's a big port town. But Wells, I mean, it's a very rural town of about 12,000 souls. And that's where Edgar Wright grew up. And he went to the Blue School. And that's where I went to school. I went to school for 11 years in Wells. And I went to what's called the Cathedral School. I went to Wells Cathedral School. And I was a boarder there. And it's a small town. And so when Edgar, I mean, I think Edgar had and Simon Pegg Edgar and Simon wrote the script, and Simon comes from Gloucester, which is the county where Hot Fuzz is set. Hot Fuzz is set in this fictional village called Sanford, and Sanford is the name of the fake town that's somewhere outside London, I think, where policemen train. So they got a little, a fake town, and cops train. They're British cops, and so they took the name, and it's set in Gloucestershire, but it's it's very much the rural West Country. And I think Edgar, from what I recall, hunted high and low to find somewhere that wasn't Wells to shoot this movie. But clearly, in his mind, the way he'd laid it out, it was always going to be Wells. So eventually, he went and shot it in Wells. And the way he shot it, I mean, it's not like one of those movies, when you're watching a movie set in LA, and there's a whole documentary about this, that people are driving down one street and then they turn left and suddenly they're driving down a street which, if you know LA, is like 20 miles away or whatever. Mm-hmm. The way Edgar shot, I mean, he does take some liberties, I think, with the geography of Wells, but it's very much, he sort of kept to the geography of the place, and a lot of the stuff is in the market square, and the market square is a real square, and Simon Pegg's character, who has been, he starts off as this overachieving cop in London. In fact, he's so overachieving that his superiors send him to Sanford, this tiny little rural town in England, because he's making everybody look bad. And there people start getting murdered, or people start dying, and Simon Pegg's character, Nick Angel, is convinced that they're being murdered, and all the other local cops are like, what are you talking about? These are all just accidents. Even, in fact, when someone gets stabbed in the neck with a pair of shears, the suggestion from the other cops is maybe she tripped and fell. So it's all filmed in Wells, and a lot of the things in the movie are real things in Wells. There's this whole B plot where someone's swan goes missing, and the swan keeps on turning up as the film goes on. But swans are a big deal in Wells. There are these swans that live in a moat around what's called the Bishop's Palace. In Hot Fuzz, it's called the Castle, I think, but it's actually the Bishop's Palace. It's where the bishop lives. It's his residence. This big old, possibly medieval building structure with grounds. And they used to have swans that would go and, when it was dinner time, the swans would go and there were these bells with a rope hanging down from the bell, and the swans would go and ring the bell, and then you would feed the swans or whatever. So swans are a big part of it. There's a model village at the end. One of the sort of climactic sequences takes place in a model village. Pretty sure we didn't have a model village, but we had this similarly sort of, okay, but not great tourist attraction called Wookey Hole Caves, where I worked for a spell, worked for a summer or two, and Edgar worked in the parking lot of Wookey Hole Caves for a summer or two. I should point out that I didn't know Edgar. Edgar's about 5-6 years younger than me. I didn't know him when I was a kid, but I've got to know him, over the last 10 or 15 years. But so when I went to see Shaun, I have no huge memory about going to see Shaun of the Dead. I remember seeing it at Union Square Cinema, and I'm sure I thought it was great, But the thing is with Edgar's movies, especially if that's your first sort of encounter with an Edgar movie, is you're just not getting half of it. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to be a much more intelligent person than I am to notice half the things that are going on in an Edgar movie, because the plot is so propulsive and the jokes, the obvious jokes are so funny that you miss a lot of the way that it's all knitted together, and the way that jokes sort of, or things sort of reappear, and the sheer sort of brio of the shooting of the film. And so I very much enjoyed Shaun of the Dead, but then I went to see a preview in a screening room in New York of Hot Fuzz. And what are you going to think of is I spent 11 years in basically a village or a small town. And suddenly this guy's made an action movie, like a movie that both references, references lots of movies, but specifically Point Break and Bad Boys. And and then he's made an action movie in this sort of tiny town that I grew up, this tiny medieval town. And like, I knew so much of it, and it was just such a hallucinatory experience to watch this place where I'd grown up be used in this fashion. And it's because it's both, in many ways very spot on to Wells. There's a lot of the plot concerns the fact that the local residents, the local sort of chief residents, there's this competition for like the best village or whatever, and that's a real thing. I mean, it's called a different name, but I'm currently staying in a town called Usk in South Wales, probably about an hour and a half away from Wells, and like the annual flower competition in which Usk, this village, battles it out with other villages across the country and indeed across Europe, is a huge deal, like a really, really huge deal. So I'm watching this in many ways kind of spot on, if parodical, version of where I lived, but with this like 80s action movie placed on top, particularly in the last act. And it was just, it was just crazy. It blew my mind. I absolutely blew my mind. And then when it was released, it was a huge, huge hit in Britain. It was a massive hit. And then I convinced Entertainment Weekly that we should run a big piece on Simon and Nick and Edgar as this genuine phenomenon, because Shaun of the Dead had done very well. It had cost like $6 million and made $30 million around the world, and was a huge success given its very humble origins. But Hot Fuzz was probably going on for 3 times as successful around the world, despite still being it's not a big budget movie by any stretch of imagination. And certainly in Britain made Simon and Nick. I mean, there were already stars in Britain, but made Simon and Nick just huge, huge stars. And also, suddenly, I mean, Edgar had been, talking about, I think by that point had been talking about doing Ant-Man and maybe talking about, which obviously he didn't eventually do, but I think he was also working on the screenplay for Scott Pilgrim, which later went on to make. But the thing is that Hot Fuzz, I think Hot Fuzz was proof that was evidence that Shaun of the Dead was not some sort of like flash in the pan for these guys. Whether they went on to work, whether as a group or individually, and so then I was just, and so that's the point where you're like, wow, these guys are something very special indeed,
No, absolutely. And like, I remember, I saw this when I was, I guess, like 15. And I thought that it was absolutely amazing. I thought that it was hilarious. It got me onto really following, all 3 of them. And so when Scott Pilgrim was coming out, I was absolutely on board because I was kind of hooked in through Hot Fuzz, and that made me go back and watch Shaun of the Dead and kind of crawl into this, little strange cinematic universe that they had for themselves at the time. And he was definitely a very impactful, sort of filmmaker for me when I was in my teenage years and that kind of thing. Because I just felt like no one was making anything half as interesting or clever. Sort of like a Tarantino movie, but punchier, and with a little bit more flair to it, but just as thoughtful and sort of deconstructive of a genre and a type. And I really enjoy Hot Fuzz quite a lot. I've watched it loads of times now. I'm not sure how many I have at this point, but I'm still going through and unpacking and noticing little things. Like I was watching the montage of him going to the Sanford in the beginning, and they're talking about it being this great place, and they show the model town village, and before you ever get to see the model town, it just sort of seems this hilarious like play on words almost, right? He's on this way to this model town. And you mentioned the Swans, and his hotel that he stays in is called the Swan Hotel.
Right.
And so, you can continually go back through and really comb these movies, and whether it's like your first time watching them and you can get sort of just swept up in all of it, or if you've gone through and listened to the commentary tracks, because like the disc has like 5 commentary tracks on the thing, and like one of them has Quentin Tarantino in it as like a guest commentator on the track. So I think that you can always go back through, and that's what's so great about his movies is how layered and rich in detail that they all are. Yeah.
Honestly, you were
Well, yeah. There's sorry. Go on. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that you're such a huge resource as well because of the fact that you're so familiar with the area and all of that. I loved listening to you really break it down. And I was like, oh, all of these things that I thought were kind of like accidental, like nods to things were very pointed. And I just really enjoyed it.
Well, it's funny now that when I was watching it, it's not that I don't like these things, but there's so there's a house that gets blown up at one point, and actually maybe it is even a house in Wells, I don't know. But what, it doesn't irritate me, but I guess I just get slightly annoyed at those tiny things that aren't accurate to Wells. You know what I mean? Even though like 99.9% of it is accurate to Wells, there are little things that aren't. It is so jam-packed with great jokes. There is an actor called Bill Bailey who is in Spaced, and he's basically a stand-up. I mean, that's sort of what I mean is that's his main job, I guess. Although a couple of years ago he won what's called here Strictly Come Dancing or whatever, Celebrity. It's basically the British equivalent of your Dancing with the Stars. Mm-hmm. And Bill Bailey won it, I believe, and has now sort of become just a very famous individual in the UK. But he had Edgar had directed, and if you look at him, he does. I don't think he would mind me saying this. He does look like something out of Lord of the Rings. And he had a TV show that Edgar directed a season of in the mid-90s, and then they cast him as the owner of the comic book shop in Spaced. It was the comic book shop where Simon Pegg's character works, and I think his character was called Bilbo Bagshot, which kind of probably gives you an idea of what his sort of character was like. But he's in Hot Fuzz, and he's one of the cops in Hot Fuzz, and he sort of mans the desk. But actually, he's playing 2 characters. He's playing twins, and only sort of becomes evident in the course of the film, I mean, as the film progresses. And one of them's got short hair and one of them's got long hair. But also one of them there's a British author called Ian Banks. And Ian Banks wrote sci-fi novels, but also quite serious non-sci-fi novels. I mean, not that sci-fi novels can't be serious, but quite critically acclaimed mainstream novels. And when he was writing, I now get them mixed up, but when he wrote one kind of novel, his pen name was Ian Banks. And when he wrote the other kind of novel, his pen name was Ian M. Banks. And like most people, you could watch this film for 20 times and not notice this. But one of the twins that Bill Bailey plays reads a book by Ian M. Banks, and one of them reads a book by Ian Banks, and it's just like a. And I mean, it's a joke, but it's not a ha-ha joke. But you're like, I mean, I was watching this over the weekend, and I'm like, if this had been a movie where people were, where executives were really getting into, if it was like a quote-unquote Hollywood movie where people were getting notes, then I am sure there's no way that character would survive or not, because it's not really, or maybe there would have just been one, Bill Bailey would just be playing one character, or maybe it would be somebody else who's playing the character. But to me, this is just the charm of the thing. There was something about this which really amused Simon and Edgar. And again, it's one of those things that you're a little bit confused about the first time you watch it, and by the third time you're like, oh, right, okay. And then you sort of Google Ian Banks and figure out what's going on. And I also bring up Bill Bailey because so as I said, I'm staying in this Welsh village called Usk, which has just bear with me one second. One of the sort of more famous Usk residents. We know that Usk has an awful lot of famous residents, but one of the famous residents of Usk, former residents, is this gentleman, this Victorian naturalist called Alfred Russel Wallace, who one day, he was a naturalist, and the story goes that basically he came up with the idea for evolution and then wrote to Darwin in a letter about like, hey, I've got this crazy idea, like maybe religion, maybe God doesn't exist and we're all descended from monkeys. I'm sure that's not how he put it, but he mentioned evolution to Darwin, and then Darwin sort of picked this up and ran with it, and then he became famous as the father of Darwinism, obviously. I guess if it had been Wallace, it would have been called something else. But he became, famous as the man who came across or who popularized Darwinism, and Wallace faded from history, basically. But Bill Bailey, it turns out, one of his many interests is this gentleman, Alfred Russel Wallace, former Usk resident. Last weekend, just like 2 days ago, came down to Usk, Bill Bailey, to unveil a statue of Alfred Russel Wallace. And so there was like 200 people in the Usk Town Square, and Bill Bailey made a great speech. And then like people, the person who was in charge of it was like, well, Bill's going to stick around and take some photographs with people. And so if you go on, not to, you don't have to do this, but if you go on my Instagram page, @ClarkCollis, you can see a picture of me with Bill Bailey, and just after I gave him a copy of my book. And he seemed, I'm not sure he quite knew what was going on, because everybody had like 10 seconds with him, and I was like, I've written a book, it mentions you at some point, here it is. But he was good enough to hold up the book while I took a photograph of it. And he was delightful, I have to say, just totally delightful. But no, that aside, I mean, that's just one of the many great, just one of the many great jokes that these sort of granular jokes that are embedded in the story that don't, and maybe I'm missing something, but they don't necessarily move the story along necessarily, or have any particular point other than Edgar and Simon found it amusing, and all this time later I find it amusing too. Conversely, one of my other favorite jokes in the movie is Paddy Considine. Paddy Considine plays another of the cops, and he's this just amazing actor. And he's done all sorts of stuff, and he's in The World's End, one of the stars of The World's End, the concluding chapter of the Cornetto trilogy. But him and Rafe Spall, who's also gone on to have an amazing career, play the two detectives. They're the two people who really should be investigating the murders that happened in this village, but are just sort of like lazy people, I guess, or just don't believe that anyone's being murdered. And they're called the Andes because they're both called Andy. And there's one, I don't know, there's lots of great dumb jokes connected with them. Jim Broadbent, he's introduced to he's like, you're going to meet the Andes. Would you want to guess why they're called the Andes or whatever? And Simon Pegg's character goes, because they're called Andy, and which always makes me laugh. But there's one moment in a pub where Paddy Considine takes a sip of beer and ends up with lots of froth on his moustache. And Nicholas Pegg says, "You've got a moustache." And Paddy Considine says, "I know." it just always makes me laugh. Well, that's the other thing, because Somerset does have, I grew up with lots of, I went to a somewhat posh school and had any sort of, I used to have a thick Welsh accent, but I lost it going to a somewhat posh school. But I was certainly very familiar with all the accents that are in the film. There's a very kind of thick, a lot of people with a lot of thick Welsh accents. And it's just so great to see Paddy Considine going, "I know," as he has a lot of sort of froth on his moustache. I find that, very, and that's like a dumb joke. I mean, it's a really great joke, but I don't, I just like it that this film is just, operating on so many levels of kind of, it's always, sharp and intelligent, but also does allow itself, to have some sort of pretty knock around stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of humor in there just for the joke's sake. you know, for nothing else but, kind of as you put it, they thought that it was funny. And that's, I think, something that you always get off of all three of these films is, you know, whether you like them or don't, although I think all three of them are great for different reasons, they're always being done by people who were like, this is the movie that I wanted to make, you know, this joke is here because I thought that this joke was funny. And I really enjoy that nature for it, because you oftentimes see so many movies that are so polished and so made to kind of please everyone, you know, in so many different ways that they end up getting a little desaturated. And so it is nice how, especially how colorful this film is. I mean, Timothy Dalton is playing his character like he actively wants to be caught. And, and he's hilarious.
Well, I think the first time you see him, he's jogging along with Simon Pegg or whatever, and he's like, arrest me, or I'm a slasher. He's like, I'm a slasher. And Simon Pegg's like, what? And he goes, yes, you should arrest me. I'm a slasher because I manage the local supermarket and we're slashing prices. And you're like, what is going on? I don't think, I mean, Timothy Dalton, who, for people that don't know, was sort of the James Bond of the 80s. He was between Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan, and especially in his early years. I mean, I think he was in the Royal Shakespeare Company. He took a very serious approach to the character of Bond, especially Connery, which a lot of people liked, a lot of people didn't like. But he was like very much a quote-unquote serious actor. And in recent times has, I think chosen roles where he can have a bit more fun. But my God, he is having so much fun in Hot Fuzz. It is unbelievable how much fun he's having. And when because he's got this office and there's a photograph of himself behind on the wall behind him. And at one point, Edgar frames a shot so that Timothy Dalton is smiling in exactly the same fashion as the photograph of him smiling. He is just having so much fun, and I don't want to reveal what happens to him in the end, but it's actually one of the most, regardless of the genre of the film, it's actually one of the most painful looking things I've ever seen happen to anybody in a movie. I would say, just quite unbelievable. But just a couple of so he's running a summer field. Which was I guess it's a supermarket in Wells High Street, which I'm pretty sure was a gateway when I was there. But it's definitely a supermarket where Timothy Dalton's supermarket is purported to be. And Edgar, as a teenager, worked in that supermarket, which is kind of what inspired this whole element of the film. And he tells the story of, this would have been, I guess, when he was like 15 but he tells a story about, he was making short films and he won a prize, or he was on television actually. He made short films, won like prize, was invited on TV or won a TV competition, and so was on TV, but then was back working at the supermarket like a couple of days later. And he tells a story about how some kid or some baby was like sick in the supermarket, and so he had to go and mop up in like aisle 3, and as he was like mopping up all this like vomit on the floor, the manager walked by and said, not in Hollywood yet then, and just carried on walking. No, I don't think in like a mean way, but in the sort of joshing way of that people do. And the manager was called Stockwell. He was called Mr. Stockwell, and Edgar said he couldn't name Timothy Dalton's character after that because it would seem like it was made up, because well-stocked shelves and stuff. But yeah, I mean, as I said, a lot of that's taken from so much. I mean, particularly the supermarket stuff, but so much of the stuff around town is taken from real life. And if you go now to, I actually think the Swan, and maybe I'm confused. I think the Swan is elsewhere. I think it's the Crown that is where they say the Swan is. I could be wrong, but if you go to that pub anyway in the town, I went a few years ago, and there's like lots of photographs of like the shoot and Edgar and Simon and Nick all. I think they pretty much took over the town.
Yeah.
And sorry, I know way too much about this movie, arguably, but there's a running gag. There's a running gag about the living statue. One of those, it's sort of like a street performer who, I mean, I guess you have them in America where it's like they dress up as the Statue of Liberty or whatever and just stand there. But he was one of the stars, I think maybe the star of Edgar's very first movie, A Fistful of Fingers, which he also shot in Wells when he was like 20. Yeah.
No, yeah. I'm glad that you came on. This was definitely why I wanted you to come on, was for this wealth of information. So, definitely don't feel bad about sharing. This is exactly what I was hoping for. So, if you had to, we haven't talked about World's End. Do you, between Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, do you have a preferred one, one that you go back to more often? Not necessarily a favorite. It's hard to sort of pick between them.
Well, I would have said, I mean, of the three of them, I mean, I've always been more of a fan of horror and sci-fi than, I guess, cop movies to a degree. So I generally think that Hot Fuzz is my least. I mean, I have certainly said over the last few years that probably Hot Fuzz is the one that I would watch least. But on this rewatch, I was like, what are you thinking? This is amazing. This is absolutely, this is amazing. And this is like essentially this guy's second movie. And it's so accomplished. And in many ways seems like, maybe not on the writing level necessarily, but on a technical level, just seems like a real jump up from Shaun of the Dead. I mean, which doesn't necessarily make it a better movie, but like, his, I mean, all of the cuts. I mean, one of the sort of recurring themes in my book is Edgar, whether it's a TV show or a film, that Edgar's kind of shot it in his head before, in the course of writing it, and then has to explain to people what he wants to do, and often has a hard time doing that. And that goes all the way up to, Baby Driver, where, before the recent Last Night in Soho is his most recent movie. And you can, trying to explain to somebody that you're going to make a film that has music all the way through it, and that everybody sort of is in time to that music, but that it's not in any way a musical. I mean, even in broad strokes, that's hard to define. It's hard to explain. But when you start trying to do the nitty gritty, and I believe when Edgar sent out scripts to studios or whatever, then you could sort of read the script and listen to the music at the same time. But people have always had difficulty understanding what Edgar plans to do. And if you look at just the opening sequences, as you say, with Peter Jackson, and you're just introducing a lot of stuff, and the cuts are so fast. And there's this, and it's only this time I really noticed this. There's not a lot of action until the very end of the film. There's stuff that happens. There are chases and whatnot, but all the real action, I would say, occurs. Well, I mean, there are some bloody deaths, but all the real action occurs in the last 20 minutes or so. But you don't think that, because he's got this sort of joke, which again, I mean, it's a joke and it's sort of not a joke, where every time Simon Pegg fills out a form or produces a pen or does anything to do with the paperwork of being a cop, which he keeps on saying is what being a cop is really about, like, it's treated as if it's, it's as if it's another tooling up scene from an 80s action film, or or The Evil Dead or something. That clicking a pen is like a gun going off. And the other thing I noticed this time around actually is it's also got a horror. It's like it has got a slasher movie sort of hidden in it. It's got this hooded, this robed character wandering around committing, at times spectacularly gory deaths. There's the scene where the journalist, who's played by Adam Buxton, who's Joe Cornish's one-time comedy partner, really. Adam Buxton plays the sort of the local the local journalist, and then this bit of the villain or the villain's henchman shoves this big stone, part of a statue, essentially, part of the building off a church, and it lands on Adam Buxton. And there's like, it really, like, you see for quite a while this guy without a head, with this big piece of masonry on his shoulders, kind of standing around in a manner that, I mean, no complaint, but rather defies the laws of physics and theology. But it's just like, wow, this is like, this is like proper horror movie stuff, and the death of the woman, I was saying earlier, the death of the woman who gets the shears in her throat. And I mean, the whole plot, again, I mean, another thing that they're referencing, I mean, yes, he's referencing action movies, but he's also referencing all those movies of kind of cults and conspiracies in the countryside. So, the casting of Edward Woodward as the head of the NWA, the what's it called? The local sort of the Neighborhood Watch Association or Alliance. Yeah. Edward Woodward very famously was the star of The Wicker Man in the early 70s, not the Nick Cage version. The star of The Wicker Man, in which, he plays a cop who goes to a remote island, run by Nick Christopher Lee, and the whole thing's a cult, and he ends up, burning alive. But that's that's the wonder of Edgar, really, because it's perfect because Edward Woodward was in The Wicker Man. Also, Edward Woodward's a great actor. You know what I mean? I mean, he's a really good actor. So Edgar's never really. It's one thing to have Joe Cornish have two words and a mask. That's fine. I mean, I suspect actually Joe's there because he just turned up on the day or whatever. Or they needed somebody, or not to be. I expect his body's in the room. But what I mean is, if it's like a proper role, then Edgar is happy to sort of nod towards one of his influences, but always really, if the guy can or the woman can also do the job, he's not going to do like stunt casting where they're not possible of pulling off the role. Which is and that all the way through the cast, that's the case, all the way through his films. I mean, with I don't know if you've seen Last Night in Soho, but Terence Stamp. I mean, Last Night in Soho, Edgar's new movie, is very much a sort of like Hot Fuzz. It's both a tribute to a place and a time in the case of Last Night in Soho, but also a warning about the place. And Terence Stamp plays this quite sinister figure in modern day London. But Terence Stamp is a British actor who reeks of swinging 60s London. I mean, he's done lots of great things since then, but he's one of those actors that helped London to swing in the 60s, really. And so Edgar, the casting of him is very much a signpost in the direction of Edgar's influences, but also Terence Stamp is just great. So, I mean, he could be, so it serves that double purpose. It's never at the expense of the performance of the story.
No, never. And that there are so many things to appreciate about Edgar Wright films, but I think I honestly don't think that I've really watched an Edgar Wright movie where I ever felt like anyone was horribly miscast, anyone felt like the sore thumb,
or that the cameos were all that was. I got to see somebody because they were famous, and that was it, and it was just kind of like a throwaway moment. No, everybody shows up to play the part that they're asked to play. And I really also very much appreciate that. We all like seeing famous people, but I don't want to just see Brad Pitt because he's Brad Pitt.
Right. And also I was trying to work out how many Oscar winners were on screen, and I lost count almost immediately. But it is worth pointing out that another of the cops is played by Olivia Colman, who is now, known as this, incredible actress, Oscar winner, The Crown, but at the time this was made was very much known more for her comedy chops, really. She was in a British show called Peep Show, which is quite popular here, and you can. I mean, it has like a cult following in the States. And Jesse Armstrong, who is one of the main writers of Peep Show, has now gone on to create Succession. But like Olivia Colman is just plays this. I mean, I guess it's not the most PC character ever, but she's just this like randy, or at least double entendre spouting kind of, cop. And it's just a joy to watch her just be filthy, I mean, it's amazing, and she's great in it. It's just, I mean, there's always someone on screen that you're like, I mean, Stephen Merchant pops up as the guy who loses the swan. It's just one terrific sort of turn, I guess. After David Bradley from Game of Thrones is in it. I just like there's just so many, like there's so much. I mean the repetition of it, as with all of Edgar's films, you get these phrases that they're repeated again and again. The one I really like is crusty jugglers. The local townsfolk are obsessed, and this is like a genuine concern people have in small towns. But like the idea of travelers or quote unquote gypsies kind of, coming in, and, jugglers, a lot of people think jugglers are a real pain in the ass. So, the idea that various members of the local, the prominent members of the local townsfolk are obsessed with, getting rid of the living statue. People in hoodies, which was hoodies became quite a thing in Britain about 10 years ago. People were obsessed with banning hoodies. And crusty jugglers, which is such a great, phrase, I think. And that thing, it's just like there's no line really there's very few lines that don't pay off. That early on, Jim Broadbent talks about Simon Pegg's predecessor. And he says, well, he had something that you haven't got. And Simon Pegg's like, what? And Jim Broadbent goes, a big bushy beard, which is, I mean, he's Jim Broadbent, so it's a perfect line delivery, but also, possibly an hour and a half later, or certainly an hour, Simon Pegg's character discovers all these corpses, crusty hoodies, crusty jugglers, and then some skeleton with a big bushy beard, which really it just pays off all that time later, which is quite amazing. Packed. This film is packed. I mean, it's 2 hours long. It's not that long.
But it's.
I guess it's fairly hefty. My God, it's absolutely packed. I do remember when they released this. Certainly in London. I think Edgar did this in maybe both New York and LA, maybe just LA. But he would put on like a season of films, of double bills, of the movies that inspired, that helped inspire the film. And I remember going to see in London, a couple of films, like a couple of Hong Kong movies, I think, Super Cops. I can't remember the details now, but I do remember him saying, because I think they showed, is it Bad Boys 2 that they keep on talking about in the movie?
Yeah.
It's Bad Boys 2, right? And I think he would do a double bill of Point Break and Bad Boys 2. I remember him saying that he'd kind of forgotten that Bad Boys 2 is like 2.5 hours long. So it was actually like a long, I think he when he set this up, it didn't occur to him that that's like going to be like a 5-hour spectacular once you like an introduction and a Q&A. But I mean, I'm sure it would have been entertaining.
No, absolutely. And he even does like a full-on Michael Bay helicopter shot, like right at the end as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that's the thing that you think, like, because as I said, there's an hour and a half before it really becomes an action movie. And it's such a nice surprise because you think, well, you just assume they haven't got the money to do this, I guess, or don't have the sort of like chops to do this. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly the whole, the whole neighborhood watch association, it turns out, have been carrying around like Kalishnikovs in their baby prams or whatever, or under their suspiciously long coats, and it turns into just a full-on action fest, which is in this medieval marketplace. it's really quite amazing.
No, it is. And I honestly, I think that it is so layered that I still haven't gotten, bored of watching it. It's endlessly clever. And it is really impressive, he's continued to make great films, but on a certain level, he's almost never really made anything, I think, quite like Hot Fuzz again. And going into the references and how just like deep and packed and specific it is. If I'm not mistaken, in one of the commentary tracks, he talks about how the music that plays during the reveal of the guns and the run away from the house out of fear that the sea mine is going to blow up is like the music from the Lethal Weapon 2 like teaser trailer or something. Like it's a fascinating movie, and if you somehow haven't missed it, I think it's kind of a must watch, both as an action film and also as a British film in a weird way. I think that this is probably one of the UK's greatest like additions to the action film genre in general.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the history of I mean, I'm sure if Edgar was here, he would point out 50 great British crime movies, but that's Edgar Wright. But there was sort of a tradition of you didn't so much have British crime movies as you had American, or movies with American stars in which they played an American cop who for some reason has to end up in London. You know what I mean? Like there's a I think it's called Brannigan. There's a 70s movie where John Wayne has to come over and basically show British cops how to cop, I guess, mostly. and he's breaking all the rules. And Richard Attenborough's in it, like the guy that would go on to direct Gandhi and of course be in Jurassic Park. And Richard Attenborough's the head, the head of the London cops or whatever. And he and John Wayne form this odd thing. Although there is it's not in the Shaun book, but the guy that plays Steve Emerson, who's the stuntman actor who plays the publican in Shaun of the Dead, who turns into a zombie, was one of the stuntmen in Brannigan and gets thrown into a jukebox, which is what happens to his character in Shaun of the Dead. And so they made Shaun of the Dead, and then Edgar and Simon were watching all these movies to when they were writing the script for Hot Fuzz. And they're watching Brannigan, and this guy gets thrown into a jukebox. And I think Edgar turns to Simon or vice versa and was like, was that Steve? Was that Steve Emerson? And Edgar said the weird thing was that he said that the weird thing was that Steve Emerson is, loves telling stories about, his career. And I mean, he's an elder, he's an older gentleman now, and quite reasonably he's fantastic. He's been in a lot of Bond movies, and it's just one of those people that's happy to reminisce. And Edgar was like, you would have thought, though, that as we threw him, or as we threw his character into a jukebox, he would have pointed out that this was the second time that this had happened. So that's a nice bit of trivia.
Well, maybe getting thrown through the first one knocked his memory loose. He couldn't remember.
That is, yes, yeah.
It's a common occurrence, honestly.
Yeah. No, the music, I mean, the score by David Arnold on Hot Fuzz is amazing. And also, it's just got all these great, Edgar's really great at, I guess like Tarantino, having these, needle drops that are perfect, but aren't necessarily, but are certainly not obvious. I mean, you've got the Kinks Village Preservation at the beginning, which I guess is probably something I might have suggested, doing as just kind of, as you're, introducing this bucolic village. But I mean, the whole thing starts with, I think it's Dog Eat Dog, or it starts with an Adam Ant track anyway. Adam Ant from Adam and the Ants, which is just perfect. Be like, who'd have thought of that? Oh, and funnily enough, so Simon Pegg is called Nick Angel, but Nick Angel is the name of the music supervisor on Shaun of the Dead. Now I'm trying to think, maybe Hot Fuzz also, but and he's someone I spoke to when I was writing my Shaun of the Dead book, and he said, yeah, one day Simon and Edgar came up to me, we're writing this cop thing, and we want to call the lead character Nicholas Angel after you, just because we liked the name. Is that okay? And he was like, I guess. I mean, sure. But he said that then a couple of years later, he was attending the South by Southwest music festival. I guess now film and music festival. And he was going through, airport security in Texas or whatever. And the guy checking his passport said, looked at his passport and went, wait, like, are you the Nicholas Angel from Hot Fuzz? And Nick Angel was like, well, I mean, yeah, I am. So walked through security, and that was it. So that's where that came from.
I was going to ask, it sounded too perfect to just be somebody's name. I thought it might have been like a reference to something. I love the fact that he just kind of has like an action hero name.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't speak to Edgar and Simon about it. I guess they just fancied his name. It's weird, and it's weird because it does seem like it's almost like too spot on, right? To call him Angel. I mean, but it was someone's real name, so I guess it just made sense to that.
Yeah.
So if you had to rate Hot Fuzz out of 5, what would you give it?
I would give it 5. I mean, I don't see. I mean, especially this time around. I just thought it was it's just a wonder. It's an absolute wonder of a movie, especially at a time now where, I mean, Edgar always says that he doesn't have a problem with sequels, but you got to remember that, like, everything was an original script to start with. The Star Wars was an original script, and if you don't have original scripts, then you don't get to make the 18th Star Wars movie or whatever. I mean, you get to make the 18th Star Wars movie, but you got to, I mean, you need original material. And watching any of these movies, or really any of Edgar's movies, but particularly with this, I was just struck by, it's that irony that it's so, as we've been talking, so indebted to so many things, as Edgar and Simon, not only would admit, but make clear in the course of the film. I mean, the film, it has so many inspirations, and yet it's really quite a novel and an original, very original piece of work. As they all are.
Yeah.
And also the balls of these people to, it's basically their second movie, and they're referencing. There's a lot of jokes about Shaun of the, that relate to Shaun of the Dead in this. The fences and Cornetto. There's a lot of Cornetto stuff in Hot Fuzz, particularly. Just the balls of these people is quite extraordinary. I mean, and justifiably so, as it turns out. But you make one movie, and then you make another movie that has a bunch of jokes about the previous movie, which is an unrelated movie. Really, it's quite extraordinary. And also, when you think about it, it's not, while Nick's character has some similarities to the character he plays in Shaun of the Dead, Simon's character is completely different from the layabout, from the slacker he portrays in the zombie film. And so even that, it's not like it's about two slackers in the country. I mean, they've really sort of remodeled certainly Simon's character, and then as a result remodeled the entire relationship between them. So even that it's quite easy if you don't. And then they do the same thing again, and not the same thing, but they do the same thing in as much as they do a different thing in The World's End. So it's not merely that they've got these two funny people kind of playing themselves in 3 movies. I mean, they're playing very different. They're playing, very different characters as they progress through the trilogy. I'd love to see them do something again, I have to say, but it is that weird thing of like expectations. The people even now want a 3rd series of Space, but I mean, with Space they were really writing about themselves, and so I don't know what that would look like nowadays. It wouldn't be the same thing, and so I mean, they made the Cornetto trilogy in a relatively short period of time, but the Shaun of the Dead's about them in their 20s, really, and then I mean, I'm using their own descriptions for this, and then Hot Fuzz is really about the job, I guess, to a degree, on top of everything else, and then The World's End's really about a midlife crisis. So and I think that's maybe why it didn't why people didn't love it so much, because it's like, well, I mean, a lot of people do really like. I mean, you know, I love The World's End, but you know what you have there is it's about a broken guy who ultimately breaks the world. I mean, it doesn't have a happy start or a happy end, really.
Yeah.
Although I guess Simon Pegg's character is happy. But my point is, they tend to. I think people think, oh, I know this irritates them. Well, they could do a Western and blah, blah, blah. You know, they could goof around in a Western. I'm sure it would have, or like in space or whatever. And I'm sure that would be all right. But they've really got to, you know, they're both writing about where they are in their lives and things that are important to that. And so I think, you know, inevitably those change as you go on. So it wouldn't necessarily be what people would want a fourth movie to be, I think.
Mm-hmm.
No, and especially now, audiences often come in with so many expectations, even more so, I think, than before. That yeah, I don't think that, to your point, I really don't think that they could make the movie that the audience would be happy with. I think that they'd make the movie that they'd be very happy with.
Yeah.
But no, and World's End was definitely more divisive, to your point, than like Hot Fuzz. I went and saw World's End with my family and one of my best friends and his now wife, girlfriend at the time, and he and I and my mom loved it. My dad and my friend's girlfriend, not so much. And so this one definitely, I think, is probably the most sort of universally liked of the three. And I like World's End a lot, but it's definitely a little bit more of a bittersweet sort of pill in that movie. You know, it's a guy who can't really come to terms with the past. Whereas Shaun of the Dead is a guy who isn't really ready to like deal with the future, you know, on a certain level. And they're all very personal, you know, and to your point, the relationships change in all three of them, but all three of them have a lot of heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that core relationship dynamic between Nick Frost and Simon Pegg is always the thing that grounds and elevates all three of the films, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think that the world building as well is something that also really grounds the story, because they're talking about things that they're familiar with, and you can tell and you can feel it, and it makes it feel cozy as a watcher as well. To, even though if I don't know all of the references, I know that they know them, and you know, I can laugh along with that, not necessarily, I guess, knowing exactly the nitty gritty of all of it, but like I can superimpose my personal, you know, life journey onto those experiences and find, you know, solidarity in that.
Yeah. I know that you were a busy man, Clark, so before we let you go, I just have one question. If you had to give listeners of the world a film or two to kind of be like, these are the most British films that you could watch, what would they be?
Well, I mean, you know, certainly Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. I'll get on to some other films in a minute. Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. There's certainly films that British people watch a lot. There's a network on ITV2. There's a network here called ITV2, which is sort of the sister of ITV, which is a huge commercial network here, and it's become like a joke how much they show Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead. And indeed, I was reading some article that was like, basically headlined, ITV2 does not show them these films as much as you think. We're sort of breaking down. And I think it's because there's two of them that people feel that they're kind of always on. Maybe just because I've been sticking with thinking about crime quite a lot, but Long Good Friday I really like, with Bob Hoskins. It's a late 70s, early 80s crime movie. With Nell and I is a sort of deserved cult classic, which I think if Americans really want to be flabbergasted by a British movie, then maybe With Nell and I is a good place to start. Yeah, and I guess with horror, I mean, like Hellraiser, I mean, that's pretty alarming. Sorry, I'm now worried that I'm just choosing things that are going to alarm and confuse people, but I don't know. I found in some ways that the more British something is, that the more, it was a huge generalization, but I find the more British something is, the more Americans like it to a degree. You know, I think there's like a cutoff where they're like, no. But but for the most part, so yeah, I think certainly the Long Good Friday is great, and although it is quite insulting towards Americans in the end, and Bob Hoskins eventually tries to team with the Germans, but yeah, and Withnail and I mean, those are the kind of movies that I grew up watching. Yeah.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to let the listeners know before you head on out?
Well, I mean, they're probably bored of hearing it, but you can either, depending where we are in the space-time continuum, you can either order or buy. I can't remember what it's called now. You've Got Red on You. How Shaun of the Dead was brought to life. I would suggest if you've made it to the end of this podcast, then A, God bless you, and B, you might want to check out this book.
No, definitely give the book a read. I read a good amount of it before we spoke, and I decided to hold off on finishing it until I got my hard copy. But it's a great book, and I really quite enjoy it a lot. So yeah, definitely go and give it a read if you're into that kind of thing. But thank you for coming on, Clark. It really means quite a great deal to us. I was very excited when you agreed to come back on again. So we'll have to do this at least one more time for The World's End.
I think we should. If you're kind enough to invite me back on, then yeah, let's definitely do The World's End.
So that was Clark Collis. We actually recorded with him last week before we even recorded last week's episode. Clark was available, and I really wanted to try and have him on, and so he was ready then, and so I jumped at the opportunity. And he was very gracious to come on, and actually now at this point that we're recording it, I can say that his book is out at this point of the recording on the time-space continuum, and it currently is a bestseller on Amazon in the UK, so it's doing very well, and it's about to come out here in the US. So if you haven't already gotten it, definitely go and get it. But he was very kind to come on, and I also thought that it would be fun to get a British perspective, for this week. I wasn't really able to make that work for any of the other episodes, but at least I got Clark on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who you would have gotten. I don't have any connections in Egypt or in India, so
I did a little bit of digging around, but I didn't really have the time to finally sort of put something together. So
hey, it happens.
Oh yeah. But it was good to have Clark on. I wanted to sort of come in and do an update on news, that's still relevant to what's happening right now. So as an update to a story that we've been continuing to cover, the IATSE vote officially happened. A resolution was sort of reached to be sent out to the members, and then the members received it, looked over it, and had like a certain voting deadlines. So I think like over 70% of membership voted, and they decided to ratify the agreement, and I guess that's the correct verbiage. And but it was narrow. It's like essentially it's like a 51-49 split. So it passed, but just barely.
I feel like it should be a bigger percentage if it's that close. If it's just like a few percentage points away, then I would feel more comfortable with maybe like a 60-40 split than,
or even maybe like a 55-45.
Yeah, because like that's just too close.
Yeah, and you also have 30%, unaccounted for as well. So, and you have to, I guess, I immediately asked the question, did they just do it out of, not wanting to? Did they just not agree with the entire process at large? Did they think did they think everything about the agreement was a joke? Like, I would immediately have questions about the 30% that didn't.
I mean, I guess I imagine that they're not very active.
Probably.
So, like, even if they could vote, they probably aren't even thinking about it because, they haven't been, really working in the system.
Yeah. But still, I agree with you. It's very narrow.
Yeah. Too close.
If we're talking like pizza toppings and everyone is like very harshly divided on like two choices, I'm going to be like, maybe I need a third choice, something that's going to get like more broad appeal.
Mm-hmm.
But no, so that's kind of where it's at right now. And so they're going to continue moving forward with making that agreement fully in effect, into the system. So we'll keep you updated with that. But it's pretty much, just signing paperwork at this point, really.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's been an interesting process. I don't think that this is the end, based on these voting results. I don't think that this is the end that we're going to hear of this.
No, there's a huge percentage of people who aren't happy with this decision. Like that, we're just gonna see this again in like 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, just give it a little time. So yeah, that's kind of an update on that. The other stuff that's happened this week, there was of course the new Spider-Man No Way Home trailer, which made me less interested in the movie.
Yeah.
It was fine.
I'm just gonna have to see it right now. After seeing the second trailer, I'm honestly less interested in watching it, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think based on what I've seen from the trailer and the news story that apparently, Multiverse of Madness was supposed to come first, I think that it's pretty obvious how they are trying to reconfigure this whole thing. We'll see how it works.
And just you saying that like they're putting these movies that are about multiverses out of order sounds horrifying to me.
Well, they restructured the plot.
Yeah, that sounds horrifying to me. You had a plot, you signed off all the way up into a certain point, and then a bunch of people said, "Fix it!" last minute, and now we're here, and that scares me.
No, that's fair. There was a fan event that happened that I thought was the silliest, most ludicrous thing ever. They had a whole fan event where you could win tickets to go to a live, in-person showing of the trailer that had a brief Q&A with Tom Holland or some sort of thing like that. And it was so... They ended up, like, sort of overbooking it, and so there was, like, an overflow hall of, like, 100 some odd people as well. So, they did this whole very silly, I think, hype event for the trailer.
Did the people know that Tom Holland was going to be there?
Yeah.
Okay, then they came to see Tom Holland.
Yeah, I guess so. But I don't care how much I want to see Tom Holland. Like, I'm not sure it's worth me, driving all the way through LA traffic to watch 3 minutes of trailer to maybe get, like, 10 minutes of Tom Holland, I feel like.
Yeah, and all of that's going to be wasted on one person's question. So great.
And maybe it was longer than that for the Q&A, but like unless it's like a great hour-long Q&A, then really I was there for just hype.
But also, like, 100 people, or whatever.
An overflow, yeah.
Yeah, we're in the overflow, so can't imagine how many people were actually at this event. It's not, you wouldn't even actually have seen him. It would be exactly how I felt when Will Smith came to our high school. Be like, this is neat, but, like, I'm not meeting Will Smith right now.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean. So that also recently happened. That's another little bit of news for y'all. There's a lot of hype around this movie. I think we'll just see where it goes.
Confidence.
Not too much terribly new or earth-shattering, I feel like, in the world of news. They announced, I guess this ties also into our what we're watching, they announced the big reunion thing. Oh, Harry Potter turned 20. Speaking of British things, Harry Potter turned 20, the films, this week. And so they decided to go and do, at the start of the new year, they're doing a big, 20 years later event on HBO Max with Daniel Radcliffe and Rupert Grint and Emma Watson and others. No no Rowling. And so for the best.
Honestly,
And so
yeah.
yeah, they're going to be doing that, and they just announced that, and I think that they're going to be like announcing more cast members and stuff like that as we get closer to it. I think it's weird that they didn't plan for it to happen sooner to the movie's actual anniversary and instead are delaying it all the way to January 1. I think that that's odd.
I mean, maybe it's maybe they're pulling a pandemic mulligan.
Maybe.
You know, who knows at this point. I feel like things are in such their own schedule nowadays, you know? Like, COVID has just kind of, like, thrown everything off where, like, a Bojangles can be closed on a midday on a Saturday. Like...
Yeah, that's fair.
We live in crazy times.
And then off of that, I guess I will also say there is now the Warner Brothers Multiversus, their free-to-play Smash Bros. Game. That's a multiplayer sort of platform combat game.
So is this like a computer game or is it like a console game? Like, what is this?
I think it'll probably be on multiple platforms.
Oh, okay.
I think that they're about to do a PC beta. But I think that it will probably be a multi-platform game. And honestly, based on like the graphic load, I wouldn't be surprised if like there is a modified version that ends up running a few years down the road on mobile, not unlike Fortnite, if it goes well.
True. I was just more curious than anything because they were talking about it being like a multiplayer game, and I was wondering if it was like multiplayer in console or not. Because
probably not.
Disappointing.
Isn't it always? So how how Warner Brothers and any of this pertains to what we've been watching, we've actually been watching quite a lot of Warner content lately. We've been watching the Harry Potter films as well as Dune recently. We just got through Order of the Phoenix yesterday. So, dear, now that we've hit the last new Harry Potter director, 1 and 2 were Chris Columbus, 3 was Alfonso Cuarón, 4 was Mike Newell. And so we finally have hit David Yates, who carries us all the way through even the Fantastic Beast films. What are your thoughts so far on Harry Potter cinematically, I guess, sort of 20 years later, and the films as we have watched them?
I will tell you what, the further into this franchise, the more wibbly my memory becomes on like what actually happens in these movies. And like, even worse on like what happens in the books. Like, I feel like I remember the books more than the movies, and I guess, you know, maybe that's my takeaway. I've really been enjoying this rewatch of them. It's been a very long time since I've touched this like whole franchise, honestly. I own a copy of the books, you own copies of the books, you know, we both have copies of the movies. Like, this was a huge part of us growing up, and I guess, you know, it still fills me with like that same like love of magic, but definitely like as the movies goes on, like it's almost like and I guess maybe it's just the way that they're written. It's like the magic slowly like disappears and they just become normal teen people in wizard with quotes around it world, because all they do is like wear muggle clothes for like the rest of the movies.
Yeah. I was 7, you know, when the first movie came out. I guess 6 going on 7. And so the books had come out a few years before that, and I hadn't started reading the books then. I really started reading, and maybe I had, but I really remember reading them, you know, with my mom and my sister and stuff, starting at 1 and 2, partially because the movies were coming out or had come out. Mm-hmm. And movies have always been, and especially were then, you know, where I gravitated toward and started first, and often would begin with something and then it would catch an interest and I would want to go and see where it came from, which continues to this day, really. So I remember like reading the first book and watching the first movie and, you know, reading the second book and seeing the second movie. And so I was really always, you know, very much keeping up to date with them. And like, we saw the third movie, we were on like a family vacation to Hawaii. And I remember I was very disappointed because the theater that was near us was a small little theater and they didn't do midnight showings or anything. And so we ended up just having to go at like 2 p.m. on Friday.
And I'm sure that devastated you, but as like a person who didn't go to the movies that often, like for me, it was like aw, boo.
Yeah. And so, well, and just also the ridiculousness of like me being like in the middle of Hawaii and being like, I couldn't see the movie at midnight. Damn it, and then
the saddest tale I've ever heard.
The tragedy of my life. And so, but we caught the movies at midnight, and like it was a big thing for me and my cousin Bailey, who's like shown up on the show. I think she was in the WandaVision episode. And the books were also big midnight releases for us as well. And so, yeah, to your point, Harry Potter was a big part of it moving forward. And I've been enjoying the rewatch. We started watching it kind of absentmindedly, not realizing that we were hitting the 20-year mark. And
it felt like a good time.
Yeah, it's that time of year, Fall, I feel like, is a time for Harry Potter. And I know that, like, the TBS or whatever always put them on at Christmas and stuff. But fall in general, for me, I guess maybe because the books always start with, like, the fall term, feels like the good time to jump back in.
Well, I mean, also, like, the color palettes of the movies are very kind of fall-themed, because we also spend a lot of time with the Weasleys, and the entire Weasley color palette is, like, the season of fall.
The Weasleys, the Gryffindor common room, and all of that.
So, like, honestly, no, I get that entirely, and, no, They always do celebrate the holidays so nicely. It definitely starts to peter out as the movies go on. But like if you celebrate Christmas, like I do understand why they play these movies at Christmas time.
Yeah. But I definitely have been enjoying them. I have been enjoying the films the further we go into them. We haven't really gotten into any of the behind the scenes material, but in the Ultimate Editions there's a sit down discussion with Steve Kloves and Rowling where they talk about how there was discussion about splitting the films in two all the way back at book 4, and Kloves was like, no, I can do it in one. And I really feel like that hamstrings a lot of the story moving forward. I think the movies do a respectable job in 4 and 5 of trying to hone it down to this is the most direct through line. But I think that there's so much that is missed along the way that sets up other things that then end up causing other issues in other films that it really just starts to become a domino effect. And I'm not looking forward to watching 6.
I mean, I'd be curious, now that all of the books are done and like we have this kind of this original franchise, I'll put it, I'd be interested in trying to tell the story from the beginning again, but with this time knowing exactly where it ends, so that way all of those through stories that got lost the first time through that ended up meaning something later on can be put in, so that way we can have a more all-inclusive story. Because I do think that those things kind of, it is, and I guess that's what I mean when like the magic starts to fade from the movies, is like we start to get further and further away from all of the things that bring the light and the joy to these movies, where we like start to focus really hard on like how hard it is, how hard the world has become, once he who must not be named has returned. And I think that's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, because I think the books remain magical, but I think the magic just gets darker. Overall, I'm really enjoying it. I probably won't watch the thing that they do. The like reunion.
Why?
I'm not really like a let's
It's
go
not
and do a
for
reunion
me.
thing, yeah.
It's not for me. We're going to our personal reunion this weekend. I don't need to watch some people that I don't know have a reunion together. What, am I supposed to understand their inside jokes or whatever?
Well, and, some of their retroactive, statements I'm sure will be interesting, but I'll just catch the sound bites,
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not the Oscars, and I don't watch that anyway, so, like, whatever.
Yeah. beyond that, the only other thing that we've really watched lately, like I said, was Dune. It's good. I think that I really, really enjoy it. I think that it does have some flaws. I think that I prefer Blade Runner 2049 to Dune Part 1. I'll probably show up for Dune Part 2.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, like, I guess I watched this one. I thought that it was really pretty. It makes space look pretty cool. I'm not really into privilege stories, but, you know, whatever. That's just not the boat that I got a rowing on. So, you know, you write what you know, and that's not what I know, you know?
Well, and Paul Atreides is definitely not necessarily, I think, at least in this version, I think that he is a little bit of a cold protagonist. I think it's a little bit hard to find a lot of warmth in him. The only time I truly feel like he has a lot of warmth, if I'm being completely frank, is his first interaction with Jason Momoa. That's the first.
Because literally everybody else in this entire movie is having a bad day, except for that one time with Jason Momoa.
No, that's fair.
It's just like a perpetual bad day, except like we get to only have it with an attractive person who has no emotions. Isn't that fun?
I think Denis is an interesting filmmaker. I think that it was fun that he got to make something so big and so bold and so his. Because there's really nothing else quite like it right now. In terms of, like, I think how creative some of the visuals were, how complete it felt like it was his. You know, it didn't feel like it was meddled with.
I get that. I guess that's how I feel about, like, the Green Knight as well. It's like,
yeah,
you know, from beginning to end, nobody could have messed this thing up, because, like, they wouldn't have been able to unmess it up. That would have ruined the whole domino effect. The whole story would have been lost.
Yeah, so I think that he always does a good job, you know, across all of his films of definitely leaving his very unique print. And he's one of the most interesting filmmakers working right now. Even if I think this movie doesn't float your boat, I think it's undeniable that he is definitely still one of the best working overall.
I think that this movie would be really cool to watch in IMAX.
Mm-hmm. I'm still thinking about trying to see it in a theater, even if we can't get it in IMAX. Mm-hmm. Just to see it on that even larger presentation.
Maybe then I'll see some emotion on Timothée Chalamet's face. Maybe. Ah.
But I think that's pretty much all that we have time for. You know, I don't want to talk y'all's ear off. I want to thank Clark again for coming on. And this week has been, or this month has been, a lot of fun, and we've got one more left. Next week is Japan, and we just watched one of the films for that. It was nuts, and we're going to watch another one coming up soon. So thank you guys for listening. As always, you know, you can check us out at thefilmbuds.com. You can check us out at all of our socials. I'll link some of those below. Definitely go and check out Clark's book. I'll also link to the episode that he appeared on, all about his book and Shaun of the Dead. And
we still haven't rated it.
Oh, right. So Lauren reminded me that this is the last thing, and then we'll go. That we got so sidetracked in the review that we forgot to personally rate Hot Fuzz. And so, what would you like to give Hot Fuzz, dear?
I'll give Hot Fuzz. Oh gosh. You know, I'll give it a 5 out of 5.
Yeah, I will as well. And I think that it's definitely deserving of that.
No, yeah, it's a really smart movie, and I think that at the end of the day, that's what I enjoy about it the most. Even if I don't personally get all of, like, the Bad Boys 2 references or whatever, but, like, I don't think you need it. I think that it's a fun ride on its own.
No, for sure. So yeah, as always, thank you guys for listening. Be sure to check out last week's, check out Clark's episode, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Bye.